Have you ever heard of the Great American Vampire Panic? It's a true story, and it's not as ancient as you might think. It didn't happen in some distant European castle, but right here in the United States, in 19th century New England. Imagine small, tight-knit communities where families were being wiped out by a mysterious and terrifying illness. People were desperate for answers, and in their fear they turned to a belief that seems ripped straight from a horror novel: vampires. This wasn't about capes and fangs. It was about a very real, very deadly disease we now know as tuberculosis. But back then they called it consumption. The name itself is chilling, isn't it? It was as if the life was literally being consumed from the patient. They would grow pale, thin, cough up blood, and slowly waste away. And the most terrifying part? It spread through families like wildfire. One person would get sick, then another, and another, until an entire household was gone. Without modern medical knowledge, people struggled to understand what was happening. They knew the disease was contagious, but how? They saw their loved ones dying one by one, and it felt like something supernatural was at play. A dark force seemed to be draining the life from the living, even after the first victim had been buried. This is where the folklore came in. The belief began to spread that the first family member to die was not truly at rest. Instead, they were a vampire, rising from the grave to feed on the life force of their surviving relatives. It's a terrifying thought. The person you loved and mourned was now the cause of your family's destruction. This belief wasn't just a quiet superstition whispered in homes. It led to desperate, gruesome actions. When a family was afflicted by consumption, the local community would sometimes resort to a grim ritual. They would go to the cemetery, dig up the bodies of the deceased family members, and perform a horrifying inspection. What were they looking for? They were searching for signs of vampirism. According to the folklore of the time, a vampire's body wouldn't decompose like a normal corpse. So, if a body was exhumed and found to be unusually well preserved, with blood still in its heart or organs, it was taken as proof. Of course, we now understand that bodies decompose at different rates depending on temperature, soil conditions, and how they were buried. A cold New England winter could easily preserve a body for months. But to the terrified villagers, a preserved corpse was an undead monster. This brings us to one of the most famous and well-documented cases of the New England vampire panic, the story of Mercy Brown. It happened in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. Yes, you heard that right, 1892. This wasn't the Dark Ages. This was a time of telephones and electricity. The Brown family had been devastated by consumption. First, the mother, Mary, passed away. Then the eldest daughter, Mary Olive, followed 2 years later. Soon after, the son, Edwin, fell ill, and the family became desperate. Neighbors started to whisper that there must be an unnatural influence at play. They suspected that one of the dead Brown women was a vampire, preying on Edwin from the grave. The father, George Brown, was a simple farmer. He didn't really believe in vampires, but he was pressured by his neighbors and desperate to save his only remaining son. So, he reluctantly gave them permission to exhume the bodies of his wife and daughters. In March of 1892, a group of men went to the cemetery. They first checked the graves of Mary and Mary Olive. Their bodies had decomposed as expected, turning to skeletons. But then they opened the coffin of Mercy Brown. She had only died a few months earlier, in January, and had been kept in an above-ground vault because the ground was frozen solid. When they opened her casket, they were horrified. Mercy's body looked almost untouched. There was still blood in her heart and liver. To them, this was the ultimate proof. Mercy Brown was the vampire. They believed she was leaving her tomb at night to drain the life from her brother Edwin. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. The men cut out Mercy's heart and liver. They took the organs to a nearby rock, built a fire, and burned them to ashes. But their ritual wasn't over. They took those ashes and mixed them with water to create a cure. They then gave this horrific tonic to poor Edwin, believing it would break the vampire's curse and save his life. Did it work? Of course not. It was a tragic, desperate act based on fear and superstition. Edwin Brown died less than 2 months later. The so-called cure was nothing more than a ghastly potion made from his sister's remains. The story of Mercy Brown became a sensation, reported in newspapers across the country. She is often called America's last vampire, and her case represents the final, dramatic flare-up of this strange and terrifying period in American history. Looking back, it's easy to judge these people, but we have to remember the context. They were living in a world without antibiotics, without a clear understanding of germ theory. They were watching their families die in a slow, agonizing way, and they were utterly powerless to stop it. The vampire myth, as horrifying as it was, gave them something they desperately needed, an explanation and, more importantly, an enemy they could fight. Digging up a body and burning its heart was a concrete action they could take. It was a way to feel like they were doing something, anything, to protect the ones they had left. The New England vampire panic is a powerful reminder of how fear and misunderstanding can lead people to do unimaginable things. It's a dark chapter in our history, but a fascinating one. It shows us a side of 19th century America that we don't often see in the history books, a world where folklore and medicine collided in the most tragic way. The graves of Mercy Brown and her family are still there in Exeter, a quiet, somber monument to this strange and sad tale. So the next time you think of vampires, don't just picture Dracula in his castle. Remember Mercy Brown and the real-life terror that gripped New England, driven not by a mythical monster, but by a very real disease and the human fear of the unknown. It's a story that's both chilling and deeply human. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into a forgotten corner of history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you won't find in your textbooks. See you next time.